Hello, you're watching PlayStation Access, my name is Dave, and this is 17 Elden Ring tips for absolute beginners. There are two important things to note about this video. First of all, I've assumed that this is your first From Software game, although if it's not, I'd wager there's still some useful tips in here to ease you into Elden Ring. If I'm right, why not subscribe? And if I'm wrong, tell me your tips in the comments below. Secondly, this certainly isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but the idea is to help new players to get past any initial intimidation they might feel and get down to having fun in the lands between. I truly believe that Elden Ring and games like it are for everyone. You just need to find the approach that works for you. Which is kind of a good segue to tip number 1, which is, there's a critical path you can follow, or not. Elden Ring has a very clear critical path. You can literally see it emanating as a golden streak from these rest points called Sites of Grace, both in the world and on the map. You can choose to follow this path or ignore it completely, the choice is yours, but I'd recommend following it to the first 3 or 4 Sites of Grace on the map, as these will grant you some key items, concepts and characters that you'll want on your journey through the lands between. Whilst the critical path is the shortest route to finishing your adventure, allow yourself to be distracted by the world around you. The critical path is always clearly marked and easy to return to should you find yourself lost or aimless. Likewise, the open world might offer the antidote if you're stuck on the critical path. A healthy dose of both will see you right. Tip number 2 is, embrace death. It's a big part of the game, so don't be scared of it. Death doesn't feel as punishing in Elden Ring as in previous From Software titles. There is no undead or hollowed form, and there are many more rest points. When you die, you will drop all the currency you were carrying, these are called runes, where you stood, but you still have one chance to recover them when you respawn, and their location is even marked on your compass and map. Tip number 3 is all about health. When you start Elden Ring, your Flask of Crimson Tears is your only means of healing whilst in action. Your flask contains a certain number of charges, and each charge will replenish a certain amount of health. You can augment all of this later on. Luckily, there are several ways to refill your flask. The easiest way to do this is by resting at Sites of Grace, although beware that this will cause nearby enemies to respawn. It's also possible to find crimson teardrop scarabs around the map that, once killed, will also replenish your health stash. If you're feeling more adventurous, you can also regain lost charges by defeating certain groups of enemies around the map. This encourages players to take a few more risks, as some or all of their flask charges can now be regained through combat. So keep exploring and embrace death. Whilst we're on the Flask of Crimson Tears, tip number 4, and it's a really good one, is that you can rebalance the number of Crimson and Cerulean flask charges that you have to suit your needs. This is a really important mechanic to be aware of, as flask charges are an extremely powerful resource. At the beginning of the game, I wasn't often using skills requiring FP from the blue gauge, certainly not enough to replenish in the field, so I took my Cerulean flask charge and added it to my Crimson flask instead, effectively giving me extra health. It's a huge bonus, so make sure you consider how you'd like to arrange yours when you visit a Site of Grace. Tip number 5 is not about health so much as it is about coming back to life, because in Elden Ring you will often get to choose where you respawn, at either the last Site of Grace you visited or at special statues called Stakes of Marika you can find in the world. In my experience, these stakes tend to be positioned near to places you might expect to die, so will make your journey back to recovering your lost runes much quicker. Quick bonus tip, you can fast travel from one Site of Grace to another so long as they're not located in a dungeon. Which leads me on to tip number 6, runes. Runes are the all-purpose currency in the game. They can be used to level up your character's attributes, buy items from merchants, and much more besides. Basically, you want runes. And you can see how many you're carrying, and therefore the number you'd drop if you were to die, in the bottom right of the screen by giving triangle a quick tap to briefly reveal the HUD. You can collect runes in several different ways. The main way you'll do this is by killing enemies, but there are other options too. For a start, you can sell items you have to merchants. There are a lot of readily available resource items in Elden Ring, so this is definitely a viable option, especially if you're in a pinch. Furthermore, there are also special consumables like these golden runes that you can pop for an immediate currency boost. Unlike the runes they contain, these consumables stay with you after death, so it's best to save them until you're at a Site of Grace or merchant where you intend to spend them. As an extra hot bonus tip, keep an eye out for these glowing skulls dotted around the map, as they usually contain golden runes. Since we're talking about merchants, let me tell you tip number 7, which is that many merchants in Elden Ring are also in the business of selling hints, called notes. Notes you purchase can be read in the info tab of your inventory and contain snippets of information that point you towards secrets. It's a risky enterprise as you don't really know what you're bargaining for, but it's exciting too. The info tab is also where you can find all the in-game tutorials, which is definitely good to know. If you're not sure what to buy, merchants also offer you recommendations. The choice is yours, but it's always worth a listen. One of the first things I recommend you buy, this is tip number 8 now and actually was a merchant's recommendation, is a crafting kit. Crafting kits let you turn resources into usable items whilst you're out in the field, which is a hugely useful option to have. Okay, it's time for tip number 9, and it is not glamorous, but I do think it's important, so stick with me because we are about to talk attributes. I'm not going to go too deep into this, there are entire videos dedicated to this subject, but the main tip is not to be afraid of them and to take a little time to familiarise yourself with them. A good time to do this is when you're creating your character. When selecting your character base, press triangle to show the character stats, then press the touchpad and select explanation to read a little bit about each attribute. Choosing a character is largely about matching character attributes to the way you want to play. Do you want a big load of health to soak up damage? Then you'll want points in vigor. Do you intend to use magic and special skills? Those use FP or focus points, which is determined by the mind attribute. If you're expecting to do a lot of dodging or want the freedom of carrying more gear, then endurance directly governs your stamina and max equipment load stats. You can also read a description of each character attribute at any time from your inventory screen. Just visit the inventory, press the touchpad to bring up the help menu, and then select explanation. You can now navigate over to the character status page to see what each attribute determines. There are 2 other important things to note about character attributes. One is that certain items like armaments have attribute requirements before you can use them effectively. You can find those requirements here. The second is that many armaments use attribute scaling. Come on David, you can do this. Attribute scaling shows that an armament favours a certain character attribute, and growing that attribute will increase the effectiveness of that armament faster. Not all attribute scaling is created equal, however, and the degree by which that effectiveness increases with each stat boost depends on the letter rating, E being the lowest boost and S being the highest. Okay, that was a lot, but it's important to know why you're increasing a stat and why that massive heavy sword you're swinging isn't working as well as you think it should, and how to fix it. Tip number 10 is that you level up your character by increasing individual attributes at sites of grace. You can only do this once you've met a certain character, so don't worry when you can't find that option at the start of the game. When you are able to level up, you're able to see how any changes you make will affect your character before you lock them in, so try different combinations to get a feel for how it all fits together. You can see which stats are affected by which attributes really easily as they're highlighted as you navigate over them. One important thing to note is that the attack power stats shown when you level up only relate to weapons you currently have equipped. It sounds obvious now I say it out loud, but better to be safe than sorry. At the same time you earn the ability to level up, you will gain the gift of Torrent, your spectral steed. Torrent is not a horse, okay? As well as being a trusted companion for those long, lonely rides, Torrent lets you explore areas you otherwise couldn't, faster and safer. He takes damage in your place, he takes less full damage than you, and you can use him in a fight too. If Torrent dies, and if you're anything like me, he will die, you can sacrifice a charge from your flask of Crimson Tears to bring him back to life. You earn Torrent and the ability to level your character at the same time, and they're both pretty integral to your Elden Ring experience, so try to do this as early as possible. Follow the critical path and you'll find it. We're up to tip 11 now, and this is really just a reminder that this is an open world, so use it tactically. Jump up to surfaces to gain the high ground, don't say Anakin, don't say Anakin. Move the fight out into the open. Choose the direction from which you approach action areas. There are many ways to solve the problems of the lands between, so experiment and play to your strengths. Tip number 12, and this is a life lesson, don't assume everyone you meet is an enemy. There are lots of friends to be made out there in the world, and you never know what they might be able to share with you. Having said that, just because someone appears friendly doesn't necessarily mean you should trust them. Again, life lesson. When you do meet a new friend, or anyone really, make sure you exhaust their conversation options. I met one character early on who gave me a gift only after we'd had several conversations about the very bad situation they were in. Tip number 13 is the sad news that Elden Ring won't tell you everything, but the good news that this is actually a wonderful thing in disguise. Solving the mysteries of the world, its characters, lore and items is a huge part of the fun, and there are several great ways to do this. Firstly, always read item descriptions. Much more than flavor text, these almost always explain little but hint at a lot. Secondly, get online and explore the vast communities of Elden Ring fans out there. The mysteries of this game are meant to be shared, so embrace it. And finally, be sure to read the in-game messages left by other players. These are the glowing white scrolls you'll see across the land and often hint at a course of action you should take. Beware though, as with NPCs, not everyone is trustworthy. This feels like a good moment for tip number 14, which is to encourage you to leave messages of your own. You can do this using the tarnished wizened finger, which is the very first item you find in the game, and so obviously important. Not only will this let you see how messages are constructed, and so explain why they often have this strange lilt about them, but if a message you leave is applauded by another player, you will receive a health boost. You never know when that might come in handy. Tip number 15 then is to remember that you're not alone. I've already mentioned the massive Elden Ring community and the in-game message system, and you'll quickly see ghostly white outlines walking around which represent other players playing in their own games, and the glowing red echoes that reveal the final terminal moments of another player somewhere in the world. But on top of this, there is also co-op. I'm not going to go into the mechanics of co-op in this video. Keep an eye out for several items before the first lift that will make it possible, but you should know that it exists and you should use it, either with someone you know or a complete stranger. Co-op is a big part of Elden Ring and there to be enjoyed. Tip number 16, come on, we can do this, is that your weapons can be used with one or both hands. Tap triangle and L1 to use the weapon in your left hand this way, or triangle and R1 for the weapon in your right. Using two hands with a weapon will usually do more damage, but often at the cost of speed and of course whatever you were carrying in that second hand previously. Tip number 17, and fittingly, we've finally made it to a boss fight. Boss fights in From Software games have a reputation for being particularly difficult, but more often than not, I think they are puzzles to be solved. Be sure to experiment, and remember you have so much more at your disposal than just weapons. Can torrent be used? Can you summon a companion? Can you summon a spirit? Do you have any abilities that might work? Any kind of elemental damage? Have you read the descriptions of your items? There's always a way, it's just a case of finding it. And when all else fails, being an open world game, why not wander off and try something else for a while? Don't give up, there are always options. And that's where we'll leave it for now. I could have mentioned weapon skills, alignment, spectral summons, the time of day system, stone sword keys, ashes of war, and so much more besides, but as I said, the mystery is half the fun. Let us know in the comments below all the tips you've got for Elden Ring, we'll pin the best ones, and make sure you like this video and subscribe to our channel because it restores a small portion of my health. See you next time.
PlayStation